Welcome back. We had a great session yesterday, or I thought it was great, and I got some great comments, and definitely one of my goals for the session yesterday on housing was to have people leave mulling over ideas, maybe chafing at the bit a little bit, or wrestling with these aspects of what it takes for our communities to be places that evolve and adapt over time in order to meet the many needs of our neighbors. And so my role with the Strong Towns organization is as the Director of Membership and Community or Public Engagement. In that capacity, I have the privilege of being able to talk from a Delta perspective, often as using Delta's story as an illustration of many of the things that we are challenged by. The reality that we face is that we have lost sight of what it takes to build long-term prosperity. That's the big declaration or the big claim. And in that context, the Strong Towns has identified the suburban pattern of development as being a key sort of figure in this story. That many are joined with us at Strong Towns in our mission statement. We say we advocate for cities and places of all sizes to be safe, livable, and inviting. And undoubtedly, that's almost like motherhood and apple pie. Who doesn't want to live in a place that is safe, that is livable, and that is inviting? But what we've pointed out in the first part of our mission statement as an organization is that we need our places to remove or to step back from the suburban pattern of development to embrace patterns of development that are financially strong and resilient. To such a point that if we don't get the pattern of development and sort of all of the activities that build local and lasting prosperity right, then we're always sabotaging our efforts to make safe, livable, and inviting communities. There's never enough money in the cookie jar to do the types of life-giving projects that we want to see, the improvements of the public realm, the things that we can share together rather than having to have high-quality private experiences, but substandard public experiences when we step out into the streets, into our communities. This is not a blanket statement to say everything is bad, everything is awful. We are making progress, but we also, at the same time, work better when we more clearly recognize what the challenge is. And just this QR code for those, it'll come up at the end as well, is a whole set of additional resources if you go away and you're like, oh, there was something you mentioned. Many of the articles I reference in the background are included in that as well. Should say, I'm really excited to be able to do this. I told the team, I get to talk in Delta, and it was one of these really exciting moments for me to be able to take this on. It was supposed to be in September, but I had COVID, so thank you to the Elder College for the invite. In one of the ways in which we frame the challenge of building lasting prosperity is to ask the question, what kind of a game is running a city? What kind of a game is it? Is it a finite game or an infinite game? In a finite game, think a hockey match. You have 3 defined periods with a little bit of extra time for overtime. But in that context, if you're the coach along with the players, you are managing your resources to basically be able to cover the amount of energy you expect to use over the duration of that game. And because it's relatively short, except for these long marathon matches in the midst of the playoffs, outside of those instances, you will go hard on your first shift, you'll go hard on your 5th shift, you go hard on your 20th shift. And because you want to use your resources, and we even have rules to allow competitive balance, you're not allowed to keep bringing in players in the 2nd period, and the 3rd period, and the 4th period, and the 5th period. You start with what you have, and you basically have to just run them out until they're exhausted. And the best coaches figure out ways to make sure their players still have energy for that final period in order to make that push. An infinite game, in contrast, the rules are quite different. In an infinite game, which is what establishing and running cities that are prosperous are, in an infinite game, your goal is to survive. Your goal, if there is no end point, is to actually survive, and as you go, you want to learn from the feedback. Hey, we're expending too much energy in these areas. You're also asking the question, how do we stock up our energy? Have you ever watched these charity curling matches where they'll curl for like 3 days in a row? You see them, even on the first throw, nobody's sweeping that hard. And by the end of it, they've brought in extra players from outside. They're saying, hey, come join us and participate in extending this process. And the work of building a city is much that same way. The strategy is decidedly different. We use scarce resources very carefully. We use them in ways that are often creative. We will test for a while new approaches, always with the goal of ensuring that our cities endure. This is one of the areas where we raise the alarm bell about many of the communities that have resorted to using debt, which is sort of an extraction of future energy to bring it into today in order to be able to justify the types of things that we want now. It's sort of like making a big push at the opening of the game to really let's go and win this thing, but then realizing, oh, we just used up a lot of our capacity. In the context of our cities, one writer for the Strongtown site said, we're in the midst of an intergenerational dine and dash. A significant infrastructure bill has been racked up in order to sustain a limited prosperity pattern of development. And the consequence of this is that future generations are going to be paying for the things that this present generation enjoyed. Now, there's an element of generational fairness that is raised there. There's also just a sense, this is just the way that we go about these things. And so we are challenging this, asking the question, what do we do in a situation where we have strangling exclusion in many of our communities? Vancouver, the region, is a high growth area. The consequence of this is that we're experiencing this strangling exclusion. I make a good income, and yet I continue to struggle with basic rent, basic obligations because of the amount of ways in which we've raised the threshold of who is going to struggle economically in our area. We've made it difficult for property purchasing, all of these different types of things. And we're seeing this as the growing number of the poor, those that are struggling to make ends meet, continues to rise. Or in other places, you actually see rolling blight. So this is happening smaller communities where all of a sudden they lose their economic heartbeat, they lose some of the capacity that they have, and next thing that they know, they begin to see just this blight, this inability to generate prosperity. And in this context, we are firmly in the former. I'm like, I can manage a little bit of blight. We don't have enough of that at this moment. Picking up on the needs that we have in our places to be able to sort of rest at times. Sometimes it feels like we live in the midst of this frantic sort of energy creation, and yet the question is all of that energy being put towards these goals of long-term prosperity, is more stability, more resilience, more capacity to endure over the long term instead of having quick bursts of growth, more bursts of growth, more bursts of growth, doing things like subsidizing auto plants for $13 billion in Ontario because that's going to be the thing that generates new economic opportunity in the community of St. Thomas, and then finding out that Volkswagen actually has shifted their plans and all of that money is gladly received, and yet the output of it is not actually being met with real projects. And one of the ways in which we can see this, I'll be very direct in this, I've done calculations of taking all of the privately held assets in the city of Delta. It's a little bit approximate because our numbers from the provincial government are lumped in with Richmond's in the reporting that I was seeing. There's probably smarter people that can find a better understanding of this. But if you take all of our privately held assets, so that's manufacturing plants, that's everyone's homes, that's all of these privately held properties. The ratio, I should find that number of how much we have sort of as a total storehouse of private wealth in our community. Imagine every single thing that's privately held in terms of property. In that context, the city of Delta has a corresponding $1 of public investment. So that's our rec centers, which are only a part of it. That's our libraries, which is only a part of it, but it's especially our roads, our sewers, all of those systems. And on our balance sheet, we actually call those roads assets. The trouble is you can't sell them to somebody, so it hardly qualifies as an asset in that sense. In an accounting sense, it does, but largely we say your roads, your sewer pipes, even your community centers are obligations that we have, and we're leaning on a tax base where there is just $3 of private wealth in order to cover the needs of $1 of public investment. After all, the capacity that we create for public things comes out of private wealth. And it depends on your political persuasion as to how much of that fraction of private wealth you want to be devoted to public goods. But we all recognize in a general sense that we take a fraction of our private capacity and use that for public good. And one of the challenges that we have in many of our suburban communities, as well as our spend-happy communities, is that we have run a significant amount of public investment while not allowing or even waiting for the private realm to significantly grow. And we'll look at some of the very specific numbers here in Delta, in Tsawwassen, to take a closer look at this. Just to reiterate what I touched on yesterday, when I talk about the suburban development pattern is building entire neighborhoods out all at once to a finished state. In contrast, the traditional development pattern has the sense of the evolving assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods, really encouraging this. And we actually can show and demonstrate through doing the math that these are far more financially capable in our places. And so here's an example in Ladner. Look, I'm just like, can we please have the boardwalk back? Isn't that lovely? But also notice how each of the parcels of land, except for the cattle pen, are being used very carefully. These folks could have easily built way over there on a flat piece of land. But they all chose to co-locate all along this space, right next to the water, right next to where all the activity was, and they were careful to make very good use of the street front. Very focused on what do we get out of our engagement with the public realm, and recognizing that being co-located, that is located next door to other things, actually generates and creates more opportunities. This is the idea behind much of the development that we see in these areas, a version of which the strip mall sort of took this idea and said, what if we moved it back from the street? What if we spread it out? What if we made it more horizontal? And the consequences have been significant in the way in which it has limited our financial capacity, in contrast with a traditional development pattern that was, as I said, increasingly created independent neighborhoods. So Ladner Village emerges and in time has the things that it needs. You can see this in its core platting as well. The lots start to get a little bit larger as you move away from the core. And because what you recognize here is this is where your capacity for prosperity building activity is. So these early plats reflected this age-old wisdom that this is how you built up strong and prospering communities. You didn't give it all away. You didn't create a single mega block over here and say, hey, let's just have a single project. The Harborfront Plaza, for example, in the midst of urban renewal in Ladner, said, hey, we have, they commissioned a city a consultant who came back with a report in the 60s, and it said that much of the core of Ladner is blighted, including the old city hall, including everything that we now take pictures of. And in that context, they said, it really should go and we should do this new thing. Let's build a Harborfront Center. If you can picture it in Ladner, I'll have a picture later, but it's a large, they basically wiped out most of this grid, and they basically created this single, where Jari's Market is and a bunch of these other things, and created ample parking because that was going to be the silver ticket. That was going to create the conditions for prosperity. And we can actually see the flagging fortunes of those areas, even as the businesses on Delta Street continue to churn out the capacity for prosperity within our communities. The change of development pattern has significant consequences. And the change of development pattern, the traditional development pattern was always about an ongoing adaptation to local pressure, accepting incremental change and ensuring greater financial opportunity through proximity. So you can see this here. Again, all of these businesses could have been over here, could have been over here. They could have had large parking lots if they set up over here, but they all said we need to be in this zone, we need to be in these spaces. And this is something that we can see in the era of the big box stores. We've created facsimiles of this. By devoting so much land to the storage and movement of cars, we've limited our capacity to do these types of things where you park once and then benefit from a whole range of different services that are available to you. This is, I want to illustrate this ever so rapidly in terms of how you build local prosperity. At the first ground level, if I didn't put Brainerd, Minnesota, you might have imagined I was picking on a place in BC or anywhere else. This is a very common story. Simple structures, wooden structures. These are small bets. These are individuals that know they might go broke or they might make a buck, and they're willing to accept the risk of both. They're willing to engage in these types of things, and they are testing to see if this is a going place. So this is not the same as saying we're going to plunk a giant shopping mall right here and see if it thrives. No, they're starting with small bets. They're making incremental investments, and they're doing so in tandem with multiple people in order to say, if your ship rises, my ship will rise with you. And we're going to turn our community, even just in 20 years, I showed these slides yesterday but didn't explain it as fully, into something that now is more substantial. You can see the introduction of vehicles as well as the introduction of new public amenities, so streets, where previously you had mud, because that's what you do when you're using public resources very carefully. You don't overcommit. But by this time, they said the amount of economic activity happening here can justify what we do here. And this is that calculation that we so desperately need our places to really master. And by 1930, you see even a more substantial and further down. So this development pattern is spreading its wings further down that street, making greater capacity. And each of these buildings is benefiting from it. So this is 1930. This is what it looks like today. And this is not so uncommon. We have plenty of places like this Lander Village comes to mind as an example where we took steps in both realms, and I'm grateful for the steps that we took to preserve the more traditional development pattern on some of our core streets. And as a result, people want to have a market there, people want to walk there, people want to be there and live there even now that they're finally allowed to in larger number. And as a consequence, when you ask what is the amount of economic activity that is justifying the maintenance and the upkeep of this type of public infrastructure, the posts, the street lights, the fire brigade, all of those things, compared to how much activity is actually occurring in these spaces. And yet these are much better quality roads at a much higher repair and maintenance cost. These are much better light poles. There's way more public infrastructure invested in these things, and yet far less economic activity happening on them. This is where we say we have to be so discerning about where we spend our public resources and look to get maximized returns on that investment. We see this even in the contrast of the fronting of the street, that thing that the public maintains, versus the way that we see this auto-designed approach where buildings are flattened so that we ostensibly you are a little bit closer to the front door when you come into the parking lot. One of the interesting things in our little downtowns, I will say, when people say, oh, we need more parking downtown. I'm like, take one of those little rolly meter, those things that you use to measure distances. Go to the closest non-accessible parking spot, measure how far it is until you get to the first thing that you can buy in the store. That should be now our new sort of measuring rule that we use. And if we apply that in Lander Village, that gets you around the block. That gets you a significant way where the first spot needs to be, and yet many people accept in this context, they say, we can't add more businesses there. We certainly can't add a second story because where are the people going to park? And yet, if you said, hey, the distance for this is actually going to you could have a little municipal parking lot there, or you can do other types of things to build in that fabric rather than it all having to be situated right on that main stretch. This is an example in Fargo, North Dakota, building for cars versus building for people. So two identical streets. This is, virtually identical. You can see the public investment in the streetcars. You can see the investment in the roads. They've brought in various modern amenities. You can see the acceptance of height as an indicator of growing financial capacity, that a building of this size actually radiates its wealth capacity into the surrounding areas, justifying more public expense in that area. I'll show you the other one. So if this is what it looks like today, they chose the path where they said, hey, we got pushback from the traffic engineers when we wanted to do things like curb bump outs. They wanted to return some street parking on diagonals to slow the cars. They wanted other traffic slowing devices, and the engineers said, well, that's going to cause gridlock. We need rapid movement of vehicles. And they said, no, we've always been overly concerned about that, but we needed to make our place a gathering place. And you can see the evidence of activity here. This is what happened to Main Street. Main Street instead was pushed to be that thoroughfare, pushed to be that space that's dominated by automobiles, and you get a very different development pattern. This is the example of Brainerd as well, where they said, we're all in on the automobile. We're going to raise buildings, we're going to remove them, we're going to do the harborfront shopping plaza sort of thing where we take away a whole bunch of the fine-grained buildings that we have there and we replace it with service parking because that's the way to the future. And the consequence is you get a development pattern that just does not work in the same way and doesn't return the same amount of value.
Yeah, it's very alienating.
It is, yeah. And so the question is, when we have opportunities even to do simple things like we totally ripped up this road. This is Elliott Street in Ladner. We ripped up this road and we had every opportunity to move even the little drains and do all of these types of things. But we still have the poles stuck right in the way, which BC Hydro won't move those poles. But that doesn't mean that the city of Delta couldn't have said, hey, if we don't need to accommodate vehicle movement as our max value, this to me is a value statement. It says we will not adjust even a little modest curb bump out. We won't even fix that sidewalk in the midst of having the crews there that are able to do that. Those are value statements that we say we care less about this and we just want the predictable road built to the standard of a road rather than doing the things that are necessary. Or here, this is called a desire path. This is right at that corner where you go. Those little diagonal paths are just normal. It's what we do, and you can see probably some gardener has been instructed, make sure you block that off. We want people going around, or people have complained, oh, it's unsafe because people walk through the parking lot and I don't know where to expect them. The reality is, this is normal human behavior. And some good soul said, let's make that formalized just by putting down some paving stones. They haven't been repaired. They haven't been kept up, and yet this is what the difference of an auto-based sort of orientation versus a people-based orientation looks like. And I just want to reiterate, like, this is the consequence when it comes to our development pattern. This is what happens to us when we make these types of decisions. Deborah, talking about the opportunity here, leaving this as is rather than just doing simple things like integrating. Right here we could have basically a raised platform with a waterbed beneath it, allowing that water to saturate, adding a bit of greenery, and doing some really vital pre-screening of all of our stormwater, pre-screening of so many of these different types of things. This is in Boise, Idaho, and they actually even added in seating. And you can see the value that brings, the capacity that adds. Even I wish, why can't that just go that way? So that way it's a little less of a barrier, but I digress. There are so many of these things that we can do, and one of the principles that we have at Strong Towns is to act to make our places more financially productive is often going to result in slowing the cars, and we should just accept that as a consequence of what we need to do. The city of Calgary has rolled out these great barricades that are really effective at trialing things. So this is a curb bump out that's been trialed just by using these concrete blocks. You pick them up with a set of forks, you move them into position. We make, on 56th Street as we drove in, I took the bus home yesterday, so I mixed up my boats, but full confession time. But they are, right now, there's cones and you have to go all sorts of wishy-washy ways in order to be able to move down the street. Why? We are enabling the reconstruction of that street. Which raises to me then, if we make modifications of our street to enable the response to an accident, to enable construction, what if we take similar steps to say, let's enable child safety? Let's enable senior safety. Let's make sure that even out here, right at the corner here, what if we said maybe the curb radius of where those curves are, or those turns onto 56th Street, maybe they're not totally working for us. Why don't we trial very simple narrowing of those lanes so that way when pedestrians are crossing, they have a direct diagonal and they're not trying to do this like, you know, we deliberately at the sidewalk are lengthening the distance that someone needs to travel. And I see that reflected in some of the design decisions made of what passes for these areas of low speed places. And low speed places are remarkably financially productive. A rural highway in southern Alberta is not financially productive as a place for people, as people boom, 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 whiz by. But we know how to do the opposite. We know how to make really great low-speed spaces, and yet we refuse so often to do that in our public realm. I love this way of describing this. Apologies, we'll translate into metric. Both are 30-kilometer-an-hour zones, but only one of them is designed like it. And it's interesting, this type of design is actually quite passive. It isn't that you have to go in and really define everything. And notice there's no signs that are telling you this. We actually have a saying, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you design the street wrong. We see this all over. This is actually part of the challenge where we really grapple with how do we ensure that we get the outcomes that we want. Someone says, I want a safe street. The city says, hey, we're going to introduce a bunch of chicanes here. We're going to introduce some of these little cone things to basically just slow down the cars. My current fixation is at every fire hydrant, we do a bump out and we plant a tree there. Because no one's allowed to park there, and we can have that bump out actually serve as a thing that everyone needs to move around, and then be able to also add in some public beauty right in that space. You remove the asphalt, you re-pour sort of a simple curb, you could have that space right then and there, and the water engineers are like, oh, trees and water lines don't mix. They do. Every great city mixes trees and water lines, and they're just fine. You deal with the consequences because you value the outcome of improving the places for people. And so instead of installing this type of stuff, which comes in at a significant cost, we could do much lower cost solutions to actually experiment and tweak. And this is a key part of what it takes to build prosperous places. Well, let's talk about the specifics of the financial productivity of our places. Locals Cafe in Ladner sits on a 0.34 acre lot. That includes a cafe and then the offices above. It's assessed at $4.7 million, or if we take a per acre approach where we say, let's assess it on a like-for-like basis, it comes in at $13.8 million per acre. So if you built in this style, you would routinely see entire swaths of streets at $13.8 million per acre. And I'll tell you, on Delta Street, you can do El Posto, you can do all of those different streets, and you'll see this. I actually had a tougher time in Tsawwassen, and I'll get to why that matters. Yeah.
You said like.
Yeah.
Like to like what? How do you get from 4.7 to 13.8? Like what?
Yeah. So let's use the analogy of, so like to like is, if this were also just on 1 acre, how much value would it store compared to if that development was on 1 acre? Or if this was, say, situated on a 0.34 acre site, would it have the same value based on its development style? And so we think of this with miles per gallon. So we do this with, if I drive my big Ford F-150 and I have a slip tank on the back, I can drive a lot further than you can in a Ford Prius. A Toyota Prius. But if you have that Prius and that Ford, and you say on an inputs to outputs basis, which one effectively performs more effectively, the answer is what's going to be the Prius, because its miles per gallon is significantly higher. And so that's what we look to do with valuing things on a per acre basis. It uses a common unit of measurement, the acre, and says if you take up less of that acre, but you're very efficient with it, then you have a much more development, or your pattern of development is a lot more effective than the other. Yeah. Well, the idea is the only thing that we don't have more of is land. So we are constrained by the land. So the question is, what do we do with that scarce resource? And the question of development patterns is, what do you put on land and accept as sort of the norm or the standard? And so, this is our beautiful McDonald's in Ladner that Mayor Lois Jackson insisted had to be distinctive. And I like that it looks a little bit like a barn, although as a farm kid, I'm like, that's not a real barn. But it does have some interesting sort of elements to it. But it is not nearly as productive because of the significant amount of land that's devoted to the movement and storage of cars, exclusively for McDonald's. It's not that people going to the park next door can use that lot. There's lots of restrictions there. And I actually ran into the challenge that I was able to pull up the property taxes per acre, which is a very valuable thing to be able to assess as well. Like, how much do we get out of each of these things? But the city of Delta has turned that off for some reason. So please ask the city of Delta to turn it back on. I don't know totally why, so I'm not imposing any narrative as to why that's occurred. But as of 2 years ago, we were able to do it when I last did it. And then the McDonald's was paying 1/7 the amount of property tax that the locals was. And so my gag line was always, how much do we value the McGriddle that we're willing to subsidize it to such an extent that we say we want more of this and less of this. We don't want, or we don't make easy this type of simple development, and yet we roll out the welcome mat for every franchise that comes in. They've got pre-stamped drawings, and we say, yep, go for it. We are successful. Finally, we have an Olive Garden, was always in Alberta, the standard of public achievement. And so how do we compare cars? Again, on a mile per gallon basis is the easiest way to say how much input do you need in order to get how much output. And on that basis, we can see that the distinction between the ways in which our places are performing. So let's look at the Beech Grove Cafe. So this is a 0.12 acre site. It is valued at $1.58 million as a property. So that's what it could be purchased for, roughly, depending on your realtor. Its value on a per acre basis is $13.2 million per acre. Think of this as the store of capacity, as well as a suggestion that if we had a little bit more like this, say even on Beech Grove Road, which currently is not allowed, actually it's not because it's not zoned for commercial and low scale retail at this point. These types of things are valued at $13.2 million per acre. Take the Frogs Coffee. Is $14.6 million per acre. So this is a 0.34 acre site. Notice, as the land size is there, it's got multiple uses, and its assessed value is higher, and on a per acre basis, it is even more financially suitable. And this has something to do with the fact that it is a little bit closer to more people. Beech Grove Cafe is a little bit more at a distance, but even in that context, this is a fairly well-performing building. Then we come up here. This is just around the corner. This is situated right on the street. It's mimicking in many ways this traditional development pattern by having lots of different bays for stores. It's pulled up to the street on a 0.3 acre site. Its value is $9.6 million, which results in $25.4 million per acre. But let's compare that to the McDonald's. So again, we shift the development pattern. We say our standards are different. We want every car that comes to this place to be parked there. We want every lane to be available for a double drive-through. This is what a double drive-through causes in our community, is the sapping of its economic potential. And so I'm not making a moral argument, but just a fiscal argument. It's not about whether or not we should eat more McDonald's or have more Panago. It's about the capacity that we create in our communities. And so this is $6.7 million per acre. The self-storage, simply by being built in a slightly more land-intensive way, using that land more effectively, actually comes in higher than the McDonald's. So a commercial business that's routinely turning over customers every single day, including me, is not as financially effective at turning a profit with a capacity, turning a profit for the community, generating additional wealth. This is the save on. Yeah, Deborah.
Can I just ask if the strip, the vegetated strip beside the McDonald's, is that part of their acreage or is that city?
That is city, yeah. So so this is property line.
They're not providing any green space.
Right, yes. Yeah, so this is our save on, which is at $8.2 million per acre. So notice, we're taking up 4.5 acres here, and this was the commitment of previous generations to say, this is what progress looks like. So what was there was, much smaller, the scale was different. Let's remove that. Let's construct a $36 million property. You're like, wow, we're wealthy. And this is sometimes a challenge when you take the percentage of how much property tax Save on Foods, I could look it up if they let me, is significant. So they bring a big chunk of change to the city every year, and you say, excellent. Meanwhile, the little Panago place brings in their little measly bit, and the city says, thank you very much. But the reality is that it's not just the Panago person, it's the accountant, it's the bank, it's all of these other things. And in this context, let's talk about the site that we're on here, is 7.2 acres, so a significant size. I'll say underutilized, and that's been quite clear for some time, only coming at $7.3 million per acre. It is less financially effective than the self-storage place. From a municipal perspective, in terms of what we reap, in terms of the financial performance of these spaces as a percentage of what it gives in taxable income. And so if you're curious about the lot lines here, this is the section that we're looking at. That 7.2 acres only returning $7.3 million per acre. In contrast, or maybe in comparison, the little store out in English Bluff, 0.29 acre site, $7.3 million per acre. One of these is situated right near a bus stop, right next to all sorts of other services, right in the midst of a lot of public investment, and it's not this one. This one is not even near most customers in Tsawwassen. and yet is returning on an equivalent basis the same amount of financial productivity that our core sort of town center sites are. The Save on Foods, marginally more, as well as the space that we are currently in. And so it raises the question. We have a $53 million site. It's in a prime location, major retailers. There's convenient road and transit access, 650 feet of street frontage. So in contrast with the English Bluff space, we are committing on two sides of this parcel to be able to provide public right-of-way access. We are all in on this property at only $7.3 million per acre. It requires major road improvements. There's significant public investment. The number of signals that we have installed at public expense in order to provide public access to these private sites raises then the question of how do we have sites that are 3.5 more times productive just across the street? And if we did this, how do we improve a $53 million property, the Thrifty side, to be worth a comparable $185 million from which we can take a fraction for the provision of public services? And this is where I'll pause to say, when people say, oh, the city is only doing this because they want tax revenues, I'm like, that's me benefiting when our city actually generates enough financial capacity to remember that slide that I showed you about the dike. The limited amount of private wealth that we have to tap into to cover the significant public investments that we have made. And it's in that context that when this infinite game that we are in is so resource depleted, our municipal coffers, especially as federal and provincial governments cut the amount of transfers that they send to us, in those contexts, we don't want to run out of energy. And at the public side, we don't want our municipal governments to run out of capacity, to be able to provide for basic things like street repair, basic things like park improvements, the simple things that we need in our places. And so asking this question is not just to say, oh, the city just wants tax dollars. I mean, we all do. We all do. There's a benefit to all of us when the public realm is enhanced, is improved, is enriched. And this is a core sort of economic question that lies at the heart of proposals even for the redevelopment of the space, to say we recognize it's underperforming even compared to alternative methods of developing these sites. So let's explore those alternatives, especially here in Tsawwassen, where you have on both sides of the road, right in the heart of the town center, two very, very, very low performing sites on 7 + 4, 11 acres of land. What could we do with those 11 acres? We could even just slap a whole bunch of these in and see all of a sudden increase. Or we can do things that are even more sophisticated than that. This is the town of Cochrane, Alberta. Urban 3 is an organization that assesses the financial performance of places. They actually looked at their old town, the place that hadn't had very much economic activity going on, but was really defined by simple shops like this, nothing more than 3 stories, very simple activities in the area. They compared it with the Walmart, which was $9 million per hectare, which they did hectares. I, as a Canadian, am using acres, but that's all right. But in this context, they said, look, your core is your money pit, or is your money pot. It's your area where you have figured out ways to store wealth and have that wealth radiate into the community. They actually said your practice of redeveloping your on the other side of the rails is less effective. You have managed to build new stuff that underperforms the old stuff. And so the question is, can you learn from what our ancestors did to store wealth in these places in order to make them more financially capable? Very simple. And notice each of these buildings, many of them are available to local business leaders, whereas these large sites are not. If I had to come up with $53 million to buy this site, I wouldn't be able to do it. But if there was a property, $800,000 for some of these sites, that would actually be within reach. And here's one example. So this is not to say we need just this all over the place, but it would certainly help if we had some more of this. I actually had to pull up on the BC assessment site. It said, how many of the units do you want to look at? And I was like, all of them. And I was like, okay, there's 24 stacked into this building. I didn't realize there are 24 discrete business units within this 5-story building. All 24 units comes in at an appraised cost of $21 million, but it's only occupying a 0.32 acre site. which means that this blows out of the water many of the other things that we have. And when people say we don't want that, Tsawwassen isn't that, we can't afford that. The challenge is like these are the types of things that actually radiate wealth into street improvements, into the types of things that we want to make our places a little bit more effective. And oh, I love a good BC Hydro pole stuck right in the middle. But before I go off on that, and this works itself out in so many different ways. This is Medicine Hat, brand new big box store, comes in at $1.9 million per acre. Comparing that to my favorite Sugar Daddy cheesecakes in the downtown, coming in at $6.1 million per acre. This is Medicine Hat numbers, so we look at that and we're like, man, wouldn't you love to have a property that you could pick up for cheap? But even in that context, you're like, how is it that something that was built brand new to spec so woefully underperforms that old throwaway building? She ain't pretty. This guy has had to do a lot of things to try to beef it up just a little bit, and yet this thing is just a workhorse, powering away, sustaining the wealth within the community. And this is where we talk about the need to be routinely adapting to local pressure. And what our ancestors recognized is that when this shop, which probably was constructed as a very simple structure, when it either burned down or when the time came, they said, let's add on a second story. And they didn't have to go through the rigmarole. They didn't have to go through extended rezoning bylaws and hearings and being told by city planners, no, we're not interested. No, we don't do that. As I've heard of various projects that have been proposed, and I'm like, that seems like a good, modest, sensible thing to do. And in this context, what you accept is incremental change because it brings new additions to the party. People participate in improving your community. Even as you work on that focus, I think some of our city planning really needs to focus in on how do we ensure greater opportunity through proximity, not through dispersion. When you disperse retail outlets, you sap their potential. You don't have as much of an ability to really store and capture a lot of activity and a lot of wealth in these areas. The strip malls really resemble a lot of that challenge. This is Annapolis, Maryland, but I just want to sort of use this as an illustration. We don't have the numbers for Tsawwassen this morning. But they went and looked and they said everything that was built before 1951, which from yesterday we talked about the expansion outwards after the Second World War as the suburban development pattern sort of took hold. This is basically all that was constructed under the suburban experiment. A totally radically different way of building communities compared to what our ancestors would have done in terms of the gradual sort of development of communities involving their thickening up. So these are today's numbers in terms of how much they contribute, not only in revenue, but also how much it offsets their costs. So there are costs associated with every mile of street, every mile of sewer, all of the different activities that you want, providing public schools in these areas, busing kids to schools at considerable expense, all of those different types of things. And they said, which of these zones are covering their costs and which of them are net negatives? And you can see almost entirely it's this zone here that actually is old school, that actually was covering its bills and providing additional capacity to the rest of the community, whereas everything else was largely unable to do that, except for a few sort of isolated instances where that popped up. And this is what I shared from Tim, the builder in Wisconsin. He said, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity, or in the context of an infinite game, we're not doing so hot in our charity curling match. We're all exhausted, or we've exhausted many of our reserves. We've exhausted many of the things that we would need because of every extra kilometer of pipe that we've put in the ground that is aging, that we are desperately trying to keep up, but we're really struggling to live with the consequences of this. And it looks a little bit like this. In Delta, it's a little bit harder to do this, but especially in the States, but we can see this in Calgary, we can see this in Edmonton. In the traditional development pattern, what you would see was public investment would follow a sufficient amount of private investment. So think of the image I showed you of Brainerd. They didn't immediately pave the road. I'm mindful of the Southlands experiment experience where much of the public infrastructure had to be put in up front. That's our design standard right now. Very little was left as gravel lanes or other types of things once the construction crews were done, even though over time what you would actually expect to see is that as new residents move in, there would be additional capacity to be able to do this. And I think I don't want to pick on Southlands at the moment because there are more and more of really innovative developers that are doing simple things there, like we leave certain sections unbuilt, until at last we have the financial capacity to do that. But a lot of our cities took a different approach. They said, we're going to build a highway interchange. We're going to run our utilities out to the site. We're going to construct the frontage roads. We're expanding our water treatment. We're doing a 50-year expansion of our water treatment system because we expect growth. City of Medicine Hat did this, and they were paying, there was one development that they had done all sorts of public investment in to get it developer ready. They put in extra sewer capacity, extra water capacity, and it was costing, because only 7 homes were built in that development, it cost them $60,000 per home on an annual basis to cover the debt that they incurred to do this type of development. And at Strong Towns, we say, we need to learn a lot more if you do very simple things. You start a fire brigade. Let's just make sure we work together. You start a waterworks. You build a library eventually. In contrast here, we can see the biggest bet is that you expect to get paid off for all of this. The reality is you can get some of it, and you can see in new housing subdivisions built. But what I've seen in Lethbridge, Alberta, where my folks live, is they built the Walmart out in the outskirts near the new development, Legacy Ridge is called. And in that space, the Walmart goes in, and my brother's a contractor, and so he was chatting with another contractor, and the guy said, yeah, they've asked me to put a 15-year roof on this Walmart. And Lethbridge, Alberta has wicked winds. It'll tear the hair off your back. But in that context, my brother said, why are they doing that? They said because they don't expect to be there any longer than 10 years. They look for their properties to depreciate to such a point that then they've returned through depreciation and all of the tax accounting tricks, they're able to basically get back what they put into it, and then they move on to the next place. Their marketing team basically says there are enough high net worth individuals in this area, we're moving our store there. Which means that they're not a reliable ally to make sure that you're going to recoup all of your costs. Or we could say the McDonald's in Ladner has not justified the amount of public investment that is immediately adjacent to it. We've provided it with hospital access, police access, fire access, probably the best fire access in the town, at a fraction of what we could otherwise be achieving through public investment. This is just south of here. If any of you have been to Mount Vernon, Washington, I took a look at their Walmart and compared it with the Skagit Valley Food Co-op. So the food co-op is right in their downtown area, built into the existing urban area, and it's on a 0.22 acre site. Walmart comes in with an annual property tax. They get in their private jet from Bentonville, they fly in, and they're greeted to a hero's welcome as they drop $327,000 on the grateful public accountant in Mount Vernon. Meanwhile, the folks over at the Skagit Valley Food Co-op, they scrape together all of their pennies, and they come in with $27,000. Okay, clearly we want more of this, a lot less of this. And that's the example we can see even with Save-On. They walk in with a significantly larger bill. Now, if the co-op occupied a 2.42 acre site in a similarly productive way, it would equal the total assessed value of the Walmart on its 27 acre site. So if you built in the style of the co-op, you would only need to build on a fraction of that amount of land to have the equal amount of financial capacity that you created with one Walmart. And so one square is 0.22 acres, one green square is 2.6, only a handful more, and you're already up at the amount that you're generating through this development pattern. Which raises the question, how much tax revenue is lost through the change in development pattern? And this is a key thing where I said, yes, that's a big one that comes in on that private jet from Bentonville. But actually, if we had asked them up front, can you develop in the style that our ancestors were familiar with? They would be bringing in all of these chunks, or more likely, you would have many more owners all participating in the process, all bringing these things in to use that 27 acres, or in our case, 11 acres, much more effectively. This is, again, just illustrating, demonstrating it. This is a heat map where we looked at the financial performance of Lafayette, Louisiana. We're a long ways away from Lafayette, but these are great illustrations of what we have here. I'm going to show you 2 slides. Look at where the green zones and the red zones are. And then, which is, these are the areas where it costs a lot to provide services and very little property taxes come in. These are the areas where there are costs to provide services, but actually way more property tax comes in, so that they are a net benefit to the municipal coffers or a net drain. I'm going to show you 2 sets of images here. Which of them do you think is the green zone, and which do you think is the red zone? Which, maybe I should ask the question differently, which would the realtor advise you to buy in? Or which would be the indicator of having achieved something? Probably not this. These are the areas even where like garbage collection is a little bit spottier. The complaint calls don't come in as frequently, so there are fewer standards. And yet what we have found is that the affluent neighborhoods were very different in terms of their financial performance compared to the poor neighborhoods, even the little downtown areas. And notice, you see those giant spikes. Those aren't towers. Those are just two-story buildings. Very simple, but concentrated activity is the core to making places that will work. And when we can see that concentration increase instead of dilution, we benefit ourselves. And this is where I want to pause or take a moment to say, when people say across the city of or the town of Tsawwassen, we do want to see more growth. We can ask that question. It doesn't have to be massive transformative growth, but it can be a lot more like filling in the gaps, using existing land more effectively, subdividing previously subdivided subdivisions, doing those small things, adding in additional capacity, building wealth where we live in our community. A longer quote, but we've become very good at finding ways to pay for new growth. That part is easy. It's fixing and maintaining all the stuff that we build where we struggle. It's sort of that early burst of activity in the infinite game, that first round of the charity hockey match, and you're like, all right, first period, let's go get a bunch of goals, and sure, you could probably score 10. That's often what it looks like when we build up brand new things, and we're excited. But after a while, they start to look like Winskill. After a while, I love Winskill, we use it regularly, but it's starting to show its age, and we really struggle in where are we going? Are we going to just our own capacity to cover the cost of that? And we need federal money, we need provincial money, we need to bond it or borrow for it. We need to basically go figure out some way in order to make that happen because we don't have the means ourselves. We've exhausted our local capacity, even though that is a local asset that we should be maintaining, we should be keeping up. I mean, very provocative, I know. But new growth will often create an illusion of wealth. It's sort of that new growth can sometimes look like a ton of energy at the opening of the game. But local governments that experience growth look and feel successful. They have high revenues and very little immediate costs associated with them. But long term, as each of the promises they've made come due, and the local government has to go out and do the work of maintaining a great community, the illusion begins to dissipate. And we're seeing more of these places that are really grappling with their long-term liabilities. The city of Calgary has a $65 billion infrastructure deficit. That is, each year they are saying we are doing road upkeeps, and or the city of Winnipeg has done this too, where they put out press releases, record amount of roadway improvement investment. And it's a fraction of what they need to be doing. Delta is actually in a similar situation. We've managed our affairs and our finances slightly better. We've not expanded as much, thank God for the ALR in many of our environmentally sensitive areas. These types of strategies have actually really helped us to be slightly more concentrated and prevent some of the dilution. But this is the challenge that we often lose sight, especially with 5-year capital budgets like we see in our communities. We're getting better at this in asset management, and we're miles ahead of Americans, I'll tell you that, on asset management. But even then, when you build that road, it's pretty good. You maintain that road for a while, you can extend its lifespan. But all of a sudden it comes due, you've got a big bill to pay. And that is the thing that if you are not sufficiently creating the financial capacity from these years, from those earlier decades, including making sure that property taxes are not so low that they cover so little, like a skimpy bikini rather than the things that you need to keep you warm and dry. In that context, what you result in is suddenly these shocks, these sudden system failures where you're like, our water treatment is at capacity, we don't know what to do, help. And when I worked in the Federal Ministry of Northern Ontario Infrastructure, FedNor it's called, briefly for 4 months as an intern, I was right in 2007 into 2008, and it was all about shovel-ready projects. They were trying to funnel money out the door. And Chuck Marohn of Strongtown says, a shovel-ready project is just one that somebody said, we need to do it, but we can't justify asking anybody in our community to do it, so we're going to ask other people to do it. Now, it often commits cities to actually still having to put up matching dollars, all of these types of things, but we're playing catch up because we haven't addressed the financial capacity needed to get us to this point. We need to value maintenance deeply. We need to maintain what we have, not allow it to gradually decline, and then say, hey, we're just going to go in. Now, in a road situation, one of the things that happens often is by not maintaining enough, by not doing the simple things, you actually move up this period of time, and you decrease the period of time when you can be earning sufficient capital to be able to cover those costs. So we need to maintain these things. And with that, with Bill as my timekeeper, we're going to take a break for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back into the question of transportation and how it relates to prosperity. I know that this is, there's a lot, I always grapple in a presentation with, okay, we can cover things that we generally think about or give some flavor, some elements of this, and the recording is working effectively today, so then that will be shared out afterwards if you're like, I want to kind of mull that over and take more time with this. But want to pivot to the question of building prosperity through transportation decision making, and what it takes for us to be able to build places where, I was just having a great conversation here about the idea in the earlier section where we talked about prosperity and what does it take for financial prosperity to occur. But deeply down, and I can say this especially as someone, I've pastored congregations, I care deeply about our community. I'm working to get a nonprofit housing co-op started. We had our first steering committee last night, meeting last night, which is great. And I coach soccer, do all these things to help build kids' excitement and capacity in a place, but also my own. And it's that prosperity of the full person that we are chiefly aligned with. It's chiefly desirous of. We've put together at Strongtowns t-shirts that are our vision statement of everyone to live a good life in a prospering place. And actually transportation is the flip side of land use, or they are co-related in really important ways. That many of our land use decisions, the types of things that we talk about how do we set aside land for effective use, are deeply influenced by assumptions that emerge out of our transportation practices and often are not well served by the transportation decision making that we make, or transportation decisions that we make. And I want to highlight this, for example, with the question of this cord. Is that a useless purchase? Well, it depends. If it just sits in your garage and you never use it, it's a useless decision. But if you connect it from one productive source to one output where you want that productivity to occur, or electricity in one end to spinning motor on the other end, suddenly that thing, you're glad that you had it because you can do a lot more with it. Many of our simple, modest investments in public infrastructure should be viewed in this way when we use them very carefully as an extender, as something that adds capacity really nimbly, really effectively, can be deployed in lots of different ways. And the first one that I want to talk about is a bike lane, which is often something that will pop up, say a strip of bike lane right in front of a high school. And especially in the States, but even in Canada, in Doug Ford's own cabinet, you'll see people that say, that is useless. I don't ever see anybody on it. I'm like, well, if it's not plugged in, if it hasn't yet been plugged into a productive area, and it's not yet connected fully to the next productive area, then you are going to get less use out of it, yes. But not having it means that when you go with your electric weed whacker, you don't have your cord, you're not doing anything with it. But the moment that you have that, you can actually accomplish what you want to accomplish. And this is a core element of what at Strongtowns we say, what we need to reorient ourselves to when it comes to transportation decision making, when it comes to the ways in which we approach many of our public investments, we're calling for a course correction in so many respects. And actually, I'll reflect on this just ever so briefly on the way that the federal government, when I was in working in minister's office, the call went out. Who needs money and can put people to work really quickly? And there was a preference for larger projects that would have bigger checks to take pictures in front of. Now, I know I'm caricaturing politicians to a certain extent. There was some decision-making criteria there, but it was, hey, this place gets a sewer plant, this place gets a road upgrade, this place gets a new bridge, this place gets these things. And at Strong Towns, we would say that has an addictive quality to it. It often feels very satisfying to put a large amount of money into a single project and then just wait for good outcomes to emerge. We actually say, let's be much more discreet. Let's be much more discerning. Let's first begin by humbly observing where the people in our community struggle. And we actually deploy thousands of Strong Towns members do this on an almost daily basis, especially in what we call local conversation groups, where they do this together as groups in various communities. We have 273 of these local conversation groups across North America right now. In these places, they'll actually go and walk and say, where is someone struggling right now that we can see visibly in our built environment? And then ask the question, what is the next smallest thing that we can do right now to address that struggle? The city of Medicine Hat, their city staff did this, and they said, there's a school and we constantly have speeding complaints right out front of where the kids are being let out of the school. Instead of hiring safety guards or instead of doing all of those things, they said, what can we do to just change that intersection of where they're coming out and make it really clear? So they used a bunch of bollards. They totally narrowed it in. If you're coming in with a larger vehicle, you have to navigate that space. You actually have to wait for the other person to come to you, and it's great. And the result of this, with very simple means, they said, what is the next smallest thing that we can do right now to address that struggle? And I'll share this, and hopefully the staff in Medicine Hat aren't watching, because preceding that, we had done a workshop with their teams. And we actually had them sit down and pick an item where people were struggling. And then we asked them to ask the question, what's the next smallest thing that you can do? And at the table I was at, they said, well, we should study it. I was like, no, that is not what we're talking about. Another said, actually, if it was about kids on scooters sort of like maneuvering through the streets in unsafe ways. And they're like, there's probably grants that we can get for scooter education. It's like, I don't know that we've necessarily caught the idea here. A grant process takes a long time. What is that next smallest thing that we can do? Could we do simple things like a sign that's like, hey, kids are at play here. Can we narrow those intersections so that way when they do jet off the sidewalk, that they are visible for at least a couple of feet before they are crossing the travel lane? Can we make it so that way when vehicles have to navigate a turn, it's more of a 90 degree rather than a 45, so that way you are more inclined to slow down? Can we introduce some edge friction in the form of just posts that stick up? One of my very dark sayings is that we value our mirrors more than minors. And this is true of our vehicle uses, is that sometimes we are oblivious to threats around us unless it's going to scratch our paint or dent our bumpers. I'm like, then do things that pose a risk of scratching your paint or denting your bumpers, and you'll change human behavior. And so we've had groups that said, hey, we notice that people are standing with grocery bags and they look to be frail at bus stops because there's no benches. So we've had groups just get together and they're like, we build benches. And they've actually had situations where it so shamed the public transit associations in Charlotte and other places that they said, now we've added benches to all of our stops. We're going to go in and we're going to roll them out. And it relates to me a conversation I had with a traffic engineer here in Delta, where I was talking about what we can do with simple investments in our streets to do things like just bringing in some cones right out front of where schools let out, really slowing the traffic in very deliberate ways. And they said, if we do this there, we'll have to do it everywhere. And I said, well, yeah, but also we don't have to do it everywhere all at once. Notice that the throwback to the suburban experiment is often, we have to do this, but we have to do this everywhere. And the answer is, well, what if we just started by doing that thing, do it now, and then go and repeat? And a key part of that repeating process is actually to continue to humbly observe and even check your work. The city of Selkirk, Manitoba, I wrote an article about them because they had brought in, for their downtown area, they did some curb work to basically narrow the street, make it a great pedestrian zone. But the construction crews were getting yelled at by drivers as they were navigating it, who said, you've put in an extra little jog here, and that is not working when I have a trailer or other types of things. And they looked at it, the city engineer and the city manager came down, they said, they're probably right, and I think we can actually just remove that jog and actually make it better. So they took jackhammers to freshly poured concrete. In most cities, especially south of the border, where you've got really intense sort of partisan issues going on, that is like, no, you just eat it. You don't do that. But they said, and they made a video, and they said, we are actively observing that people are actually not figuring this, like, this doesn't work. The geometries don't work, so we're going to get it right. It should have been gotten right in the design process, but actually design process on a computer is not the same thing as on the street, in the space. And so being willing to iterate and repeat those types of things. Now this is related, but a key investment that we can make in transportation, street trees are transportation infrastructure. Why? Because we live in sometimes a miserable climate. And if you can walk under the shade of a tree, if you can walk in the shade of a tree through the summer, you're more likely to go. We see pedestrian behaviors shift depending on if you're in a beautiful space, an enlivening space, or one that's not. In addition to that, there are so many other benefits. And I do want to highlight this, especially for Deborah, as well as, I forget your first name, but because we were talking about trees. Water interception, and I just love this image. Like, that's what we are talking about when we have these trees. And we have, water engineering questions that come up. What if it breaks the lines or does things like this? I'm like, there are many things that we can fix. And here's how we fix that, through the funds that we recapture through this process. A single tree, this is in Springfield, Missouri. I bet BC trees outperform a Springfield tree. Intercepts 770 gallons of rainfall. Ours do it all year, not even after they drop half of their leaves. It absorbs 1,500 gallons of stormwater underneath. What if we have a lot of trees? They estimated what is the value of the total tree canopy. They had, I think, 10,000 trees in their capacity, in their canopy, intercepting 13 million gallons of rainfall on an annual basis and absorbing 35 million gallons below ground. Notice, this is just storing that water for a much longer period of time. It also means if this is 13 million gallons of rain, that has not fallen on the poor sap that's walking down that street. There's one way to think about it. Is taking all of that and actually improving the space where it is. And yes, you have to deal with leaves, and yes, you have to deal with uneven pavement. But where does the money to deal with leaves and uneven pavement and even a few broken water lines emerge from? Well, look at the amount of stormwater reduction in costs. If you are trying to capture and hold and move rapidly all of that water that so quickly overwhelms your systems, that as we see in Vancouver, they routinely are still flushing sewage into English Bay because their dual source systems get to max capacity and then have to go into overwhelm mode. In that context, you reduce significantly the annual impact of their total tree canopy. You've got an extra $2.2 million, and that's just for Springfield, on your city coffers. That is money that you didn't even have to spend. So you never had to tax for it, and you never had to spend it simply by having those trees in the places where they are needed. This is where we see that net benefit, even if there is tree care and maintenance, and actually by valuing that benefit, the tree people in our city are not just the do-gooders, they're not just the owl guardians, they are the people that are actively doing things to improve our transportation systems, to improve our financial capacity as a community, to offset many of the costs that we have, which means that we should be spending more, not less, on things like tree care and maintenance. Doing this to high quality so that urban trees will live longer and continue to increase the value. And so if you take 10,000 trees, that's another net of $400,000 a year that we can be investing, even after all of your costs have already been sunk into the actual care of your tree canopy. This raises the question then, how much do we value the things that are so available to us? And this is tied into the idea that when we build roads, we should be asking, if it's a $1 million project, are we seeing a corresponding increase or at least capacity in the area for that to occur? Is $1 million in private investment enough for a $1 million project? Imagine there was $1 million of private investment, so 4 $250,000 homes. Oh man, wouldn't that be nice? 4 $250,000 homes in this hypothetical project immediately adjacent to it. Well, you would only be gaining $5,000 in property taxes off of that $1 million house. Or I mean, on those 4 homes. So what if there was 4 $1 million houses? You'd have $20,000 on an annual basis, assuming that you were not paying for anything else. So this means that you better have a lot of homes nearby in order to justify that amount of upfront investment in order to improve a roadway. And yet, we routinely say, this neighborhood, low financially performing neighborhood, just needs a new road, you get a new road, you get a new road, we want to keep them all up always. And the obligation that we create from this is really significant. How much private investment is needed to obtain $1 million in public revenue that you need the day that you complete the project? Over a 25-year payback, you need $40,000 a year in tax revenue. Well, that's actually a helpful metric for us to be able to assess when we say we want to invest more in bike lanes. Well, how do we ensure that we're going to receive more of that capacity back? Let's make sure that these neighborhoods not only are better suited for cycling, but also are better suited for incremental growth, addition, rather than subtraction from the amount of private wealth that's stored there in order to meet and fund the projects. This is the challenge when we have so many grants available, so much outside funding where we say that's where we basically fund much of the projects that we're doing. Instead, it should be at the block level. Let's figure out how we cover what's going on. Would 7.9 million in private investment be enough? Well, not when you start factor in, we've also got sewer in addition to the roads, we've got maintenance, we've got garbage, and we begin to see that we need a significant amount of private investment to go into the core things of even simple things like building a sidewalk, building a street, building a road. We took a look at this a number of years ago. This was a local street project where we said, if we looked at each of these lots, how much would we assess them? So they had said 50% of the cost would be assessed to the homeowner. It took 37 years for this type of development pattern to recoup the public contribution from the adjoining tax base. And that was by maximizing the amount of money. So they paid $6,600 up front, and the rest was to be recouped through the tax base over 37 years. This is where I would be critical of oftentimes our quest to do good things can often come at odds with the strategies that we need to make sure that we actually are capturing enough value to justify this amount of investment. This sidewalk renewal project or adding sidewalks to places where they don't currently exist feels like the right thing to do. But we actually have a very different approach and recommendation with these places. It's just make them good for people to walk in. Low-speed neighborhoods are essential. Beech Grove has fewer sidewalks than even what is currently here in the pink there, but actually is more, what's that?
That's North Delta.
That is North Delta, right. But I just didn't find an Optimist article. Maybe it's not reporting on Tsawwassen News as rigorously, but in this context, in a Beech Grove neighborhood, you actually have fewer sidewalks and yet more walkability. Yes, some of that is, I use culture in the sense of a driving culture, not any kind of like person culture, but a driving culture that says 30 is fine or 30 is enough, even lower than that is better. I actually tell people, like, drive slow in your own neighborhood. It increases your property values. It really does. And drive slow in other people's neighborhoods because you might want to like help them along as well. But in this context, when we do simple things like what I said with fire hydrants, this is a little bit of a stretch, but municipalities could do this. Just carving out those spaces, making those little bump outs, making it so that way in these zones, it's unpredictable. There's an added level of edge friction or complexity where you might lose your mirror if you go too quickly. You see even the Amazon drivers slow down. Even the Amazon drivers recognize I can't speed through these zones. And then the consequence is you actually create the conditions where you don't need to do this amount of public investment, this amount of public improvement of the public realm, where so little, because we've said this is a neighborhood, these are the corridors where growth is happening, these are the neighborhoods where we restrict most of what's happening until the province stepped in. In that context, there was very little new activity to justify the amount of added public investment, which means that we are paying for these sidewalks and more in Tsawwassen and more, and the benefits are not felt widely. And so this looks, for example, this is a cul-de-sac where you could say no one except for the people that live here actually benefit from it. So where that previous example was a through road, you could say, well, if it's connecting a school to a factory so that way the kids, once they're done, can go off to work, then maybe that road has broader purposes. But a cul-de-sac only serves one block. $354,000 to rehabilitate the road. That was 79 years to recoup the public expense from the tax base. And to break even, if they just said we want to break even, required a 46% increase in property tax rates. Homeowners don't like 46% increases on their bills. They will vote out the bums that bring that in. This is part of the calculus of the neighborhoods that we've created. And so in that context, I want to pivot a little bit to saying, like, if we focus on how do we create like dynamic, productive places, even through transportation investments, which sometimes means not doing them until they meet the conditions for that. One of the other things to address is often the concern that people have, which is there are too many cars. And I will often say the needs that we have in Tsawwassen, when people, oh, did my battery die? Oh, I've not been plugged in this whole time. Oh, dramatic pause for effect. Two layers there. So local media are open. I mean, I think that we are, one, grateful to have local media because a lot of places don't. Yeah. Two, are very responsive to the desire to provoke, stir up, get people to take notice, get people to share it, especially because of the pivot of local media to online sort of distribution and using what used to be using Facebook. Now I think it's blocked. But using those types of, or maybe, is Facebook still allowing local news to be shared? I haven't been on Facebook. Okay, just not national, right? Anyways, I didn't go too far into it, but one element of it is just being regular about writing in and participating in those processes. There's always the option to start a rival. You can start, I started a blog and the result of that was there was opportunities then to write in to the paper and creating those conditions. The other side is lobbyists are just a compensation for a perceived lack of public support or a perception that the messaging that is in the public realm is maybe not fully aligned with either private goals or maybe doesn't contain all of the facts. And so sometimes that work of lobbying can say, hey, we need to just like set the record straight here. And that is always contested. But I'm mindful that like the idea that there's just this cabal of people that are taking away all the power and decision making of sort of the lowly folks in the community is often mischaracterizing how much power individuals actually have and how much it does matter, even if one of the ways in which I think we really need to mature our conversation across the community is to be much clearer about where trade-offs need to occur. So trade-offs are not just the things that are happening in the back room, though there has to be some of that between city planners and project proponents, but actually within our community where we can say we can have uncongested streets, but it also means we won't have much activity. We can have unchanged housing, but it means our kids won't be able to live here. And recognizing and grappling with those trade-offs, we can have a street improvement program, but we need capacity to be able to fund that thing. And those trade-offs, I think, are sometimes missed, especially in our more partisan sort of discussions, where it's like, you are bad for proposing anything. I have found the alternative, which is completely acceptable, has no negative consequences in its own right. And I'm not saying you, but I'm saying, the fictitious sort of debates that occur. So that would definitely be a key part of, how I would take that on. And I think in that context, this is that challenge of when people say, hey, Tsawwassen has too much traffic. I've heard people say when there was a debate over the Hunter Road, there was a 4-story project proposed there, and they said, no one can get through this street. And so I actually, I was tempted to go look if there were like fossilized individuals, like still stuck in their cars, like waiting, like looking for somebody to come with a tow truck to move. No, people get by. It's just not at the speed or the rapidity that people might desire. Or it might be close calls. Your mirror might be nicked a few times. Similarly, at the end of 56th Street at the highway, people say like you have to park there for hours before you, I'm like, only on Boxing Day and only because of the Tsawwassen Mills, like only in those limited circumstances. But then the other challenge that I've had is if traffic conditions are so poor right now, it is the consequence of the decisions we've previously made. It's not the decisions of future plans and projects that have contributed to the situation that we have right now. And if it has gotten worse up until today, then in my way of thinking, an element of it is to say, what if we changed course on not the development side, but on the transportation side? What if we actually began to challenge and contest some of the assumptions that we have that this is a great street? This is what in Strong Towns we call a strode. It's the combination of a road and a street. So a road has the function of connecting productive places with other productive places. Think of a railroad in its most pure form, a station to station. You get off at the station, you do a bunch of things, then you go back to the other station, you do a bunch of things there. That's what a road should do. So our highways have this function. We also can use roads in our core neighborhood, or not in our core neighborhoods, but to connect places North Delta to South Delta, all of this. Streets, on the other hand, should serve as platforms for building wealth. They should be the things that are causing people to slow down, to gather, to do all of these things. And in that context, what we see across North America is the introduction of the Strode, where it's like, let's have both. Let's connect a lot of things at high speed, rapidly, and try to also have some businesses sort of holding on the side. And so we call this the futon of transportation. It doesn't function well as a couch, and certainly doesn't function well as a bed, but we're stuck with it anyways. It's taking up more space than it should to have less benefit to us than we think. And so one of the things that we say is the only thing worse than having congestion is not having congestion. And this is where we talk about the desire to really value safe streets. We have so many allies in this that really advocate really well. Vision Zero, America, in the US, America Walks. We have fewer organizations like this in Canada right now. But Safe Streets, absolutely fighting against many of the assumptions that just let a lot of people be struck and killed by drivers on our roads. But in this context, we also say we need those places to be productive, which is what I've been emphasizing, because they're a platform for building wealth. And so when we think about congestion, we should ask, like, what causes congestion? Cars have a geometry problem, which is that they consume quite a bit of space. So their dimensions are large, even though the dimensions of the thing that matters in that car is quite small, quite nimble, quite agile, able to move on foot, able to do many things, but then uses a vehicle which is significantly larger in order to be able to navigate to get to things that you need. But what is it that causes congestion? What causes congestion, highways can move a lot of people, but they start to be congested when there is some reason for people to slow. So that's off-ramps, that's accidents, that's a deer on the side of the highway, whatever that might be. So slowing, but actually stopping, is what causes congestion. Now, what causes prosperous places? Slowing to notice and stopping to engage. So that when we actually ask the question, is congestion the problem that needs to be solved? And I asked this question in Tsawwassen, do we need to make sure that our roads flush everybody through rapidly? Or do we actually want more of this type of activity? Slowing to notice things, stopping to engage in things. For markets, for restaurants, for notaries, for antique stores, grocers, for churches, neighborhoods, for little free libraries even, and even my favorite, for lemonade stands. Any place worth going to is going to have congestion. It's actually a necessary precondition of human activity occurring in those spaces. And this is really core to the idea that when you create great congested places, there's a lot of great activities that can occur there because many things are within reach, even if you don't get into your geometrically challenged vehicle. And so when you think about it, the entire purpose of a city is literally to create congestion. Ever since the first business person decided to set up a brothel or a saloon on the side of a well-used ox cart trail, the only goal has been to get people to stop. Or another way to put that is congestion is the price we pay for nice things. And I want to conflate or relate this to the challenge that easing congestion as a strategy, which results in elementary schools not being allowed to modify the street right in front of them to slow down vehicles. A shocking decision-making process if I ever know of one. It results in us spending billions of dollars on highway expansion projects, on road widening projects, on making everything bow to the goal of making sure that we can get people back a fraction of a minute in a day, is actually causing incredible costs. Infrastructure we can't afford to build or maintain. Look at the bridge crumbling report, the reports on bridge conditions, not only in BC but elsewhere. You'll be a little scared every time that you drive through a bridge. Infrastructure we can't afford to build or maintain. Distances that we are forced to routinely drive for basic things is a consequence of seeking to ease congestion. Advertising. Think of your little grocer and they put out a little leaflet and someone walking by can see it. But if you're in a car, you're going to need a giant billboard. You're going to be bankrolling the Pattison Company. You're going to be doing these types of things in order to get a few people to slow down or to notice without slowing down. And they definitely can't stop until they've gone through the whole winding moral of the interchange. Easing congestion also hurts entrepreneurs. Regional employment for regional people seems like such a reasonable goal, but it actually can create real local scarcity. It can really create the conditions where you are assuming that if somebody sets up a factory in Mission, that they're going to get their workers from Delta. Well, that goes both ways. We've seen this even Tsawwassen Mills brings in many of their people from Surrey, and the consequence of this is that the Surrey businesses struggle to attract enough employees for their own areas, rather than us meeting the needs that we have in our places. Think of your tradespeople, our contractors, our plumbers, many mechanics, others. By having subsidized the edges through transportation spending, by providing easy access to the city, you're ever 15 minutes from downtown, it actually can sink your local suppliers. If it's so easy for me to go to the Home Depot in New Westminster, I'm not going to support the Home Hardware. But I'm going to factor that in if actually we've not done the many things to roll out the red carpet for me to get there. In this context, subsidizing the edges means that a person that lives out in Mission is routinely driving to West Vancouver to do construction projects simply because the pain is not so great that they can't afford to do it. But it also means that your local builders, your local contractors are not in a position to do this. If I start my own plumbing business here, I'd love to be able to work in my neighborhood. But the reality is I have to compete with the guys from Langley. And as a consequence, because our systems are so distributed, it actually makes it far less efficient. So the thing that we prize as efficiency creates a great deal of inefficiency. Easing congestion also worsens our transportation outcomes. It will sap your transit ridership if there is no net benefit to taking the bus or taking other means of transit. It sabotages transportation flexibility as well, because we make many of our streets dominant systems only for vehicles and make them safe and are unwilling to improve them for our places. And in this context, we've said, would a world look like where we built no more new roads? We said, we have overbuilt a supply of roads. What if we just use them more effectively, more efficiently? End highway expansion and choose methods with much higher return on modest investment. The I-5 is the reason we don't have rail to Seattle. Well, there is rail. I have always wanted to take it. I've never been able to find a scheduled time that meets my schedule. It's because and they cancel it at a moment's notice.
Run occasionally.
Right, yeah. And now you go on a bus. And but this is the challenge that we have. And so as I wrap up, and I know we're at, I've got 5 or 6 more slides here. But I want to touch on this, that if we sort of pull together a big picture view of what I've tried to present in this session. One, our leaders, even we as individuals, should be advocates for making many small bets, because you can actually see some very big returns come from these things. The strategy needed for this game, for us to endure, for us to have a place that is prospering, is one that is decidedly different from sort of going for short, rapid, quick, large-scale gains, speculative bets. This is a street in Memphis. In Memphis, a bunch of the locals, including business owners, just said, hey, we've got a big problem with the way in which our streets are laid out. People don't feel safe here, and as a result, tons of vacancies on this strip. The city didn't pay it any attention because they said, what we've got here is a road, and we love roads because it gets people elsewhere. But they said, we're not elsewhere, we're somewhere, and we want people to be here. So they put in parking protected bike lanes, just rogue. Under the cover of darkness, they painted those on during the day because they're a little bit more folksy, a little bit more charming. People respected it, they put this in, and all of a sudden, within 6 months, all of the businesses were booked up, or were leased. All of a sudden, city leaders took notice. They said, hey, we've noticed that previously we were getting discounted taxes. Now all of a sudden, we're starting to see a surge of new investment come into this space. And it's partly because they said, we're taking responsibility for our space. And this is that process of saying, how do we build incrementally? How do we avoid sort of big silver bullets? This will be the thing that serves it, because the strategy is decidedly different. We need to value resilience over efficiency, things that allow us to bounce back, rather than just the things that are streamlined. Embracing, we have a way of saying, a strong town's a little bit abrasive. We'll say we need to allow for things that are chaotic but smart, and not be so enamored with things that are orderly but dumb. And getting into that mindset, I wish I had more time. I'll tell you one day about the Muskegon pop-up sheds. But another key thing is that feedback is fuel. To picking up on your comment is about feedback within the community, but seeking really active ways to learn from these processes. I'll be charitably disagreeable with the city of Delta, where I asked a question about the Ladner pop-up parks on Bridge Street. 2 years they were great, then they were closed down for a year, and then they were brought back. And I said, but in those 2 years, like, what were the stats? Did we track how many people were there? Did we have like surveys of the people that were participating, and what were our goals up front? What did we want to learn, and did we learn those questions? And a key part of why it was stopped for a year was just feedback from a couple of people. I said, but that's very limited fuel. That is like 0-octane fuel compared to what we should have had, which was a robust sense of just asking people, but also noticing what are people doing there. My favorite takeaway from that experience was the first time we were down there. Elliot and I, my son, we went 16 days in a row because he loved ping pong, and so we just kept going down in the middle of the heat dome. And there were boys there because they had set out ping pong tables. And this is that valuing just incremental sort of small things. But there were the ping pong tables, and there were the paddles and the balls there. And the boys said, are we allowed to use this? I, taking on my role as a public steward, said, yeah, isn't it great? And they're like, but what if people take them? And I said, then they just put a few more there. And they almost had this expectation. We do this with the way that we design many of our public spaces. The standard approach would be to put a chain on those paddles. And yeah, you have enough chain to make your moves. But what they recognize is we can actually just be okay with some slippage, a little bit of that chaos, a little bit of that messiness. It'll be all right. The smart, orderly thing would be to chain down each paddle and chain down each ball. But the chaotic, just accepting a little bit of slippage, a little bit of mess, allows us to make it personal, a human scale for human places. This is my wife with our guide dog puppy on the Ladner parade, working our way through the process of helping to make our places where this should not just be once a year, or maybe twice a year on Remembrance Day, but something that we just become much more familiar with. Testing, hey, what if we close this stretch just for 6 weeks? Every time we do with the Ladner Village Market, we demonstrate that it's not the presence of parking that makes for great places, because we remove all of that parking and all of a sudden we get a great place as a consequence of this. Oh, this is a whole other talk. I will talk about this. It's just showing that Delta has some needs within our community. If you're ever interested, check out the finance decoder that we're putting together on doing the math. That is another talk. Oh, no, I've got several more. All right. Very quick. Observe and respond to how people use a place. Make small incremental investments. Build a local conversation. I would love to have you join Delpop. Our group, we are not like partisan ideologues in any way, but we make a commitment. We meet in North Delta, we meet in South Delta, in Tsawwassen and Ladner. We struggle because there's not spaces that have open hours past 7:45. So if anyone knows of a good public space that is available after hours, that would be wonderful. But they're just folks that want to meet. We talk things through. We advocate at times, but much of the time we're seeking to learn. And then the last suggestion is, if any of this resonated with you, I'd welcome you to become a Strong Towns member. Again, here's that QR code if anyone wants the resources. So this is the one, that's the one I want you to click on. That's to become a Strong Towns member. That's part of my work as a Strong Towns organization, is member supported by 6,000 members. Canadians, we don't get a tax credit yet. We have over 500 Canadian members, in part because they said, even if I don't get a tax credit, I really value it. But otherwise, definitely go to the resource page and check that out. With that, with 10 minutes to spare and 200 minutes left on my mic, thank you very much. Any questions?